So moving on, we're going to talk about pest control methods. Um, Pests. What is a pest in the first place, right? A pest is any organism that's damaging valuable crops. Really, it's anything that you don't want. So a weed is a pest too, right? It's competing with the crop, so it damages it kind of in an indirect way. And so we use pesticides, right? They're basically poisons that target certain organisms. So an insecticide targets insects, herbicides targets plants, fungicides targets fungus. Um, so, you know, in pesticides is really an umbrella term. So pesticides have a long history. In the beginning, they used a lot of metal and botanicals, like nicotine was used as a pesticide. But this is the reason why in the South, like when they grow rice in the South, there's a lot of lead in their soil. And so rice tends to have a higher level of lead in southern rice, like the southern states. So good alternatives are from Asia, and then second best I'd say is from California. But now we're into second generation pesticides, and these include synthetic compounds such as DDT, which we'll talk about a little bit. There are major groups of insecticides. There are these chlorinated hydrocarbons. So basically, it's with chlorine in it. This is what DDT is part of, and these are very slow to degrade. So they're very persistent, which is why we call them persistent organic pollutants. They are banned or largely restricted in the US and really around the world, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And then there's also organophosphates, which actually affects the nervous system of certain insects. And so they don't persist as long, but they can bioaccumulate, which we will talk about in a little bit. Obviously, pesticides have benefits. There is disease control. So looking at mosquito-borne disease like Zika, Triple E, right? All of these newer ones, I'd say they're like emergent diseases, but also the old ones like yellow fever, right? So those are not good. So we want to kill the mosquitoes. And of course, malaria, and which is why we really started using DDT because people die from malaria. It is not a fun disease. It protects our crops, so pests can destroy our crops, and so this saves us from losing money or as a farmer. When I say us, but pesticides also can become resistant. I'm sorry, pests can become resistant to the pesticide, and so pest populations evolve. You have the individuals who are really genetically immune or not as right, not as prone to really being affected by the pesticide because there's genetic diversity, and those individuals will actually survive and pass on their genes, right? It's just natural selection, or really it's artificial selection because we're the ones that are driving it. But anyway, pesticides stop being effective. And so either we have to increase the chemical toxicity or apply more so that the resistant pests will die. And we call this the pesticide treadmill because it has to, or because it keeps happening over and over and over again. So cost of applying the pesticide increases because you need those larger doses and you need to apply more in order to put them on. And so the effectiveness just keeps decreasing. And so if you look at the graph on the right, you can see that the number of resistant insect and mite species has increased like crazy. Whereas in the table below, you can see that even though we have, increased our pesticide use, we're still not really losing. Right? Our rate of loss is actually staying the same. So we're not doing any better by applying more. So in killing those old pests, we create space for new pests to come about because we're reducing their competition. And so we are like so good about one pest and we're like, yeah, we got this. And then this new pest comes along and says, aha, there's room for me now, right? Anyway, and so there is this red scale on trees, right? On, I think they're lemon trees here, and you know, we never had this before, but you have these trees that have been treated, and you have this emergence of this red scale on these lemons. So we got rid of one pest, but we brought in another one. So DDT is a persistent organic pollutant, and any persistent pollutant is going to bioaccumulate because you can't break it down as an individual, right, as an organism. That's why they're persistent. And so they build up the more and more you're exposed to it. And so that would be biomagnification, where it's bioaccumulation, where over time you are building up those contaminant levels. It's accumulating in your own tissues. And then we also see biomagnification, where the higher up on the food chain you are, the more the higher the toxin levels are, because you have to eat what's below you. And so there's just this buildup. You eat those little fish, but the fish will break down, but their toxins will stay in your body and stay there. So biomagnification happens because of bioaccumulation. And this happened with the ospreys. Right? These shells were getting really soft and cracking when they went to sit on them to nest. And right, we had this massive decline in the osprey population because the ospreys were eating birds that had DDT in it. And DDT, right, those fish were eating smaller fish, and those fish were eating zooplankton, and those fish were eating phytoplankton, right? So it starts at the bottom of the food chain. Each individual accumulates it in its body, and because the top of the food chain is eating all of what's below it, it has a lot of the toxin, and you get these detrimental effects like this. And so when you spray something, it doesn't stay where it's applied. Just because I want to kill a mosquito doesn't mean it's going to stay on the mosquito, right? It's going to move into the water and the soil and the air. And so there are all kinds of ripple effects that happen when you apply these kinds of things. Not to mention, pesticides have pretty big risks to human health. So you could have long-term effects, right? Cancer, breast cancer, sterility, or short-term effects where you just have headaches, nausea, vomiting, and then, you know, in like severe cases, maybe even something happening to your nervous system. And so this is why we banned certain pesticides like DDT during the Stockholm Convention. But you can see that there are only a handful of countries that signed this. Amazingly, we did. So we banned it and restricted it. But some companies actually still make it and export it to other countries who then use it, and then those foods are then brought back into our country. So, you know, DDT is still around. Of course, there are alternatives to pesticides, which we'll talk about more when we talk about integrated pest management. But one of these is actually the use of GMOs, right? It can actually decrease the use of pesticides like this BT corn. So, right, we take the gene from the BT, I'll try and say it. I'm going to say it wrong. Bacillus thuringiensis. I definitely said that wrong. Anyway, right? It creates this, it has a protein that is toxic to these larvae called the European corn borer. And of course, we don't want the corn borer to bore our corn, so we insert the gene into the corn. They eat the corn and then they die. And so, awesome, we don't have to spray pesticides. Right? But the problem with GMOs is that it can affect non-target organisms. So in that BT corn example, you have the monarch butterfly is actually eating it, and it's not going well. The monarch butterfly is declining in populations. You have this decrease in genetic diversity. One, you end up with a lot of the same crop or monocropping, because if a farmer's investing in GMOs, you're getting a lot of the genetically identical seeds, and so you're growing all the same thing. And if I grow all the same thing and some kind of disease comes in, I lose my whole crop. Whereas if you have that genetic diversity, if a disease comes in, then maybe one part of the crop is bad, but the rest are good, and that is economically good for me as a farmer. And then another problem is that GMOs possibly cross-pollinate with wild types, and there's no way to really control pollen. So GMOs, or genetic engineering, is different than agricultural breeding or really artificial selection. And so basically we use genes, or we use individuals with traits that we like, and we end up crossbreeding. And so we've done this genetic manipulation just through breeding, not through the actual insertion of a gene. And so that is where this agricultural breeding is different from genetic engineering. And so just to review GMOs, basically we take a gene from one organism and we insert it into another organism. That second organism is creating the proteins that first organism would make. And so we have added an extra characteristic that organism didn't have before. Genetically modified foods is very big business now. Most genetically modified crops are herbicide resistant. So if you look at Monsanto has Roundup Ready soy, and that Roundup Ready means that I can spray glyphosate, which is what Roundup is. And we'll talk about glyphosate more when it comes to water pollution. However, I can spray that herbicide and my crops will be resistant. And so therefore, I won't kill my plant, and my plant will grow and the weeds won't. And like I said before, with the BT corn, that is an insect resistant plant. And so, sometimes you end up spraying more pesticide, sometimes you end up spraying less pesticide. This is it's a pretty hot topic. People, you can really fight either way, whether it's good or bad. But we really do use a lot of GMO foods all around the world. And so here are a couple of examples, like I told you about the corn, of course, but the BT crops down there are mostly corn, but golden rice, they use it to actually increase nutrition in the rice itself, vitamin A. So people in countries where maybe they're malnourished and not able to get vitamin A, this is the way to get vitamins to them. There's this Flavasava tomato, which is it lasts a lot longer, and just a couple of examples. But GMOs actually is included in integrated pest management, because integrated pest management is basically doing everything you can before you use pesticide. And so integrated pest management, and as you'll see, includes anything from manually picking out pests or weeding a garden just by hand to actually using GMOs. And so integrated pest management, again, is just reducing pests to a economically an economic level that you can deal with. So you loss of crops, but you're like still okay with it economically without using pesticides. Basically, you have this systems approach, right? You're looking at all different ways um, of managing your pests and combining those pest control methods um, to, without using actual chemical pesticides. So, like I said, integrated pest management uses many techniques, right? You're integrating many different techniques to suppress these pests. And so, we're going to go over some of these in detail, such as biocontrol, crop rotation. But, you just monitor your population, and maybe the pests aren't so bad and you don't have to do anything. Or maybe you want to bring in some different habitats, such as some marigolds to bring in ladybugs, and the ladybugs eat the pests that you don't want. Or, genetically modified organisms, you would definitely, you're not using chemicals. So that's part of integrated pest management. No-till agriculture, which we'll talk about more. Um, and also just physically picking your pests off of your plants, or weeding, right, is mechanical pest removal. But you can see in this graph that Indonesia did a pretty good job. They actually increased their yield, which is a stark difference than when you looked at the pesticide treadmill. You're increasing the amount of pesticide that you're actually using, and then um, you still have the same amount that you get, the same yield from your crop. So it worked in Indonesia. Looking a little further in detail into these methods, you could do interplanting, where there are different mixtures of plants, so in different rows or even within rows. And what it does is increases diversity. And so if you have more diversity, it's less likely for a pest to get so large that you're having trouble managing it. Right, with diversity becomes resistance. If I have a crop of all of the same thing, then I'm going to have a lot of pests, and it's not going to be very manageable. Um, Strip cutting, where I'm not harvesting my plants all at the same time. I'm cutting them down in strips instead of all at once. Proper timing of planting, fertilizing and irrigating. It could be a climate thing, where certain pests like certain conditions, or maybe it could be timing of maybe when certain pests are mating or pollinating, or right, seed dispersal, whatever it may be. If I time my crops around them, then maybe I won't have the pest issue. Crop rotation is great because, let's say, for example, I have tomatoes, which is a fruit. Did you know it was a fruit? Now you do, right? So it's a fruit down in that lower right quadrant there in my picture. And let's say I have aphids and they love tomatoes. And then I, harvest my tomatoes, and I cut all my foliage down, or my crop debris, and I leave it there because I'm doing nice sustainable agricultural methods. And then the next year I plant beets there. But the aphids that are still in that foliage don't like beets, and so my beets will be fine, and they don't affect my tomatoes because my tomatoes are now growing where my spinach was, and spinach doesn't have that problem. And so if I rotate it through, then the pests that were there before are not going to affect the type of um, plant that is there now. Also, crop rotation is fabulous for nutrients because legumes are nitrogen fixers. And so you have very nitrogen rich soil, and you rotate that through to kind of re up the nitrogen on each of those beds. But not to mention, the different kinds of plants are also using different kinds of nutrients. Good stuff all around. Moving on to biological control. Biological
biological control, is basically we're using some sort of natural predator or parasite or disease or whatever to actually control our pest organism. But you need to take care that the agent actually doesn't attack any unintended hosts so that it doesn't ripple outwards. And so biological controls are great, but problem being is that they can become pests themselves. Um, the Australian cane toad, if you want to see a funny movie, you should go on YouTube and watch the movie Cane Toads. It's actually really funny. Um, take my word, or don't, whatever. Um, Basically, they introduced these cane toads to get rid of a pest, and the cane toads became pests themselves. Um, and this is an example of not being able to predict the effects of an introduced species. There are so many little strings attached to each organism that there's no way to really know. So they have to be like very, very, very well tested before they're actually released. Um, Another problem could be that the agent may have a non-target effect, meaning that what I release my biological control for may actually have an effect on something that I do want. And that's not good either. Um, and so removing a biocontrol agent is harder than stopping pesticides. So biological controls are great, but they need to be seriously, seriously tested, planned, and regulated.